This webinar is sponsored by my friends at IronSource. For those of you here, I'm assuming you're pretty serious about growing your games business, which is why IronSource is the perfect sponsor. These guys are industry leaders for a reason, with their growth experts and tools such as their ROAS optimizer and in-app bidding solution Level Play, taking care of your game business while you focus on developing the best products. I highly recommend checking them out. I for one wish we used these guys in the early days of Next Games. Head on over to ironsrc.com to check them out. All right, let's get started. Nick, are you there?
I am here.
Good stuff.
Hello.
Hey, how's things in Berlin?
Things are all right. Getting progressively sunnier and progressively less lockdowny, but yeah, good.
That's always good. Yeah, I gave you permission. There's so many things that I always need to give a permission to, and
Hey,
like when you're starting, you need to give them permission to show video, give permission to do this and that. So and they're all over the place in Zoom. So. But yeah, we're good. We can see you and the Pocket Gamer background as well.
Yeah, that was something I meant to disable a while ago. I'll do that while you're talking.
Yeah, we love Pocket Gamer. Yeah. Hey, for everybody who's on the webinar, this is really great. It's the first time we're going to be talking about, or this is at least my first panel or a webinar talking about specific like product stuff. I've been spending a lot of time talking about fundraising for startups. So like I'll get into a presentation now, and I'll give Nick the floor afterwards to go through what he's cooked up, and then we're gonna have a bunch of time for Q&A. So if you look at Zoom, there's this Q&A section there at the bottom. So type your questions there. You can already start doing that, and once we're both kind of finished up with our presentations, we're going to jump in there. All right, I'm going to share my screen now. All right, Nick, can you see my screen?
I can, yes.
Good. So the topic of today is long-term engagement, and specifically talking about hybrid casual, which is this new genre naming. I don't know, like there's so many namings, like casual, ultra casual, hyper casual, casual. But yeah, we're going to be going to specific what that is. But first, an introduction myself. I'm Joachim Akren. I'm the founder and CEO of Elite Game Developers, which is a gaming startup school where I'm trying to give out a lot of interesting topics for myself to people who are also interested in startups in gaming. How do you start your own games company? How do you get funding? How do you get off the ground? Like start paying salaries is a really good point to achieve early on. But then, like, how do you go from there to growing things? So my background in gaming is that I founded my first company 15 years ago called Ironstar Helsinki. It was a virtual worlds company for Nokia phones, really like not good timing at all. Those devices really couldn't do anything online, like was terrible, miserable. We pivoted to Facebook games, we did a few years of profitability until Facebook decided to close down the viral channels. Then we ended up closing down the company as we couldn't acquire users. I went to Supercell for a while, did analytics there until Clash of Clans became a huge thing, and I wanted to get into that as well, and then left to start building Next Games, which we founded in 2013. And I left last year to start Elite Game Developers. So I was just saying that the material that I've so far brought out is these podcast episodes with founders, people from the industry, investors, and a blog post. But today is a kind of like a new area that we're going to go after, which is the hybrid casual. And I would say like the term was coined after the game Archero came out last year. Everybody's probably played it. It's this really cool action RPG where you're progressing with your character, doing these cool levels, a lot of skill-based gaming, interesting meta. So the meta game is something that really like here is a big takeaway. Like they really incorporated a nice RPG system on top of this really unique like a hyper casual gameplay experience. If you think about it, how simplistic it is to play. The early ads that they were showing were basically like it attracts people who also install hyper casual games, but then underneath there's this depth of all the equipments and the collection. So the game loop itself revolves around the fighting, where you're constantly going into new chapters, you're unlocking more tougher enemies, but you're also playing to beat harder content. You're progressing through your skill development, and then you get rewards for the beating the levels, gold, scrolls, equipment, and then finally you can level up your gear to even beat harder opponents in the following levels. And the game is pretty deep nowadays. They've been constantly adding more stuff into it, like rarity levels, whatnot, bringing in different kind of abilities. And there's really good material online to look at like how deep the economy is nowadays. But yeah, like how do you actually apply kind of learnings from outside of hybrid casual, like outside of Archer, what they did? What are the really like fundamentals that you should be looking at? So RPG mechanics, I think, is the place to really start. There's a lot of titles out there that have incorporated gameplay from RPG games into new ways. Like you have Galaxy of Heroes, which has the shard system for character collection, Contest of Champions, this Street Fighter-esque gameplay tied into a really deep character collector. And then, of course, like Walking Dead Road to Survival was a really interesting, deep game that came out several years ago, before the shard system was made popular by Galaxy of Heroes and Heroes Charge. Like this is how the gameplay really breaks down. You have your core gameplay, the second-to-second combat, whatnot, which is talking basically with the meta game, like how you're progressing in the economy. And then you have your live ops, which is constantly pushing in new content. And in a game like Empires and Puzzles, what is actually happening there is that you have a game which has a really deep match tree, but you also have this kind of moments where you're going back into the game, you're getting new characters. There's hundreds of these 3-star, hundreds of 4-star and 5-star characters, and the player is slowly sort of like transforming their roster towards the higher stars. So it's not automatically that you're kind of like jumping into the 5 stars, but it can take for years before you collected sort of the 3 stars and the 4 stars, and then eventually you start leveling your whole roster into 5 stars, and you're adding new characters there. And then when the elder players who've sort of reached the end, they start transitioning towards maybe a 6-star character roster. And then the whole depth comes from having a level up and an ascension system at the same time, where your hero who was a 5-star character when you got them, they stay a 5-star, but you have these kind of different leveling mechanisms going on underneath the character, so that you're sort of like the road to maximize a character is really long. And then finally, when you get them maxed out, then you're sort of like at that stage that, okay, now I'm gonna go for a 6-star, that it starts mattering. And thinking about the depth there, where it really comes from for all these characters is that you have this rock, paper, scissors system where, let's say a character is a certain type, the paper type. They can be really strong against the rock type, but then when the scissor type comes along, they're gonna beat them. And all these kind of like elements towards an RPG can really like push you forwards. And in the hyper casual space, if you have collection elements, start thinking about this these rules, sort of like that certain types can create an advantage or a disadvantage towards the other content that you have, that you're collecting. And definitely, like in Empires and Puzzles, they have, like, each character still has their own traits, how they're specialized, how they matter. And then you have the skill-based gameplay, which is super deep with different kind of abilities that the characters can have. And then an example from Contest of Champions, which really takes it more further, is like how you're moving your character. What is the second to second gameplay? Like, you're blocking, you're attacking, you're doing specials, all these kind of like character strengths and weaknesses. The player starts understanding them as they're using the character. So of course they could read a list of different kind of descriptions, but playing and learning through playing is a really big amplifier in these kind of mid-core games, which also apply in a sense to Archero. But I think there's so much more to be covered here besides what the Archero type can do. And like, when this kind of a system is set up, you can really build a meta game where you're introducing new characters who have different kind of combat abilities through the rock, paper, scissors again, where they're better or worse for something. They might have a stun resistance when the other character doesn't have the stun resistance. And there's new challenges and new skill elements constantly coming for the player. So then the other topic I really wanted to stress here is how long-term goals matter in creating long-term engagement. So I often use this analog of a mountain climber who is happily climbing the mountain, and they know that this is like the second highest peak, and they still in their career want to reach even the higher peaks that are somewhere in the horizon. But when they finally reach those peaks, they notice that there's even more and more to come. So it's more about, like, you're on a journey, you're getting better, stronger, you're learning. And how do you incorporate these into gameplays really, like, goes back into thinking about all these learnings that the players can get through just playing and learning, and also the different kind of like strengths and weaknesses towards other elements inside the game. And that mastery that the player starts getting really brings them into the point where they can think about goals for the long term from them that are interesting. So why does this matter? Why do you want to have these long-term goals? Well, this is what will make people stay in your game. If you just look at a DAU breakdown, this is like a cohort analysis. Let's say that you have people starting in the game. The colors here is like month 1. Let's say it was January. Then you have people who started in February, the red, and all these bars here represent the value where the bar charts end is the DAU, broken down by the cohort. So like here, you can see that the month 1 ends here about at the 30th x-axis point. And you start seeing that the blue lines start deteriorating because of the DAU. The people who came on the first month, there's less and less of them in the game. And then you start getting the red cohort coming in from February, who are sort of building on top of that, like how many people started in February. But then you can see that the DAU starts declining in March because you cannot sustain the players anymore. If you think about like some game which could retain players for, let's say, 10%, stay there for 3 months, and then after a year you're still retaining 4%, like you're stacking more and more of these cohorts constantly on top of each other, and then the DAU starts growing. So how do you achieve that? It's through long-term goals and really interesting things to look forward to in a game. So keys to achieving this, keeping things interesting, the RPG mechanics, which we're talking about, are really good ones to think about in all sorts of games, where the players are sort of like on a learning path and achieving and mastering new things. And the focus here should not be optimizing the monetization, but rather optimizing these kind of interesting ways for the player to learn playing and enjoying the game and continue enjoying the game. And then finally is the live ops section, which I think Nick is going to talk about soon more. So thanks, guys.
Awesome, thank you. I guess I'm up, so I will share my screen. 1 second. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Excellent. All right, so brief introduction to me. My name's Nick. I'm an independent games consultant. I focus on product and live operations, kind of within that, things like monetization, product backlog prioritization, game economy balancing, and what have you. I've been independent for a few years and worked with clients such as Rovio, Spiel Games, Crazy Labs recently. My first job in the industry was actually as a game master on a hardcore MMORPG where I was doing this kind of thing, as in virtual weddings for online characters. So I would go in and actually type out a wedding ceremony for people who wanted to get married, which was as charming as you can imagine. Apart from that, I've worked for GREE. Most recently was my last full-time job, where I was director of live ops. Before that, I worked for Ubisoft on The Division in analytics. I worked for Rovio, designing game economy monetization systems for Angry Birds 2, and Area Games on this kind of hardcore MMORPG where I was doing all the weddings. All right, so what I want to talk about then are some of the strongest methods to monetize and retain users, which come from mid-core, hardcore, but are now being used to drive KPIs in casual. And as Joachim mentioned already, sharding is a big one. So sharding, basically, as I'm sure most of you know, breaking down content into smaller parts. So instead of receiving the hero that you want in one piece, you have to receive it in 100 pieces, and it's a lot longer to achieve. But it's not just about giving players longer term goals, it's also about actually giving them help along the way. So you are not just saying, okay, you have to get 100 of these things, but you're rather saying, you have to get 100 of these things. Here's 20 to get you started. You can get another 5 here, another 10 here. And it's giving players smaller goals within their progression. In hybrid casual, it's been now expanded to other genres. So for example, in Sonic Forces, you have a sharding system to unlock new characters for the racing that you're doing in that game. In Empires and Puzzles, as we talked about already, like it's basically a match 3 game, but the levels of meta on top of it are very deep, and the sharding is almost its own gameplay, like on top of it. It's a meta game, but in reality, some people are just playing for the sharding side of things now and trying to unlock the heroes. Asphalt 9 is a great example of how to do sharding. I will explain that a bit more on this slide, but basically some kind of key tips for when you are thinking of introducing it in your hybrid casual game. Don't sell your best hero shards directly. So make sure to come up with a more logical roadmap and the methods by which you distribute them. So that is to say, live operations, like structured events, have an understanding of when your heroes will be released and actually players will be able to use them. And this fits into something called product lifecycle management strategy, which I'll talk about more on the next slide. If your game is very linear, then introduce some kind of limitation so that players aren't just going to get the stuff that's like right at the end. And Asphalt 9 does this in a really clever way. They have a garage level. So basically, you can collect shards throughout the game. It's largely PvE. There are some PvP parts of it. you can collect shards of any car that you want, but unless your garage is leveled up enough, you can't use them. So if my garage is, let's say, tier C or something like that, then I can only use tier C cars. I can't use tier B, A, S, or any of the really fancy things. Basically, this is a really good way of making sure that in a game that's a bit more linear, you can't have a spender who comes in and just buys, I don't know, a Lamborghini and wins all the time. Like, they have to actually follow the progress. And then lastly, a really key thing in sharding is trying to make sure that investment in all characters or cars or whatever the item is feels rewarding and useful. This is a big challenge because obviously, take an example of Galaxy of Heroes, Marvel Strike Force, whichever game you want, players will gravitate towards the heroes that they like or the characters that they like already. But actually, Marvel Strike Force does this really well and gives you different missions and different objectives that require you to have, let's say, henchmen leveled up, or it requires you to have characters that you wouldn't usually go for. So it forces you to diversify and try and level up as much as you can all of your characters instead of just sticking to your favorite team, for example. Sharding also then gives an advantage in live ops. So this is looking at product lifecycle management in a game that I used to run called Dragon Soul. And in Dragon Soul, basically, we wanted to make sure that players were engaged in collecting shards in the long term. So we defined a life cycle for each new hero, as well as the hero skins. We focused on shards for midterm goals, and we prioritized like high revenue and engagement mechanisms, meaning that when we released a new hero, we really wanted players to be able to unlock it through very competitive play initially. So players spent most in competitive areas. So that was a good place to put like a new hero or shards of the new hero at the top of that leaderboard prize, so that, you know, everyone will compete to get the most shards they can, so they can be the first to have the new hero. And then once you've done a few competitions like that, you start actually reducing the value of the shards. So you move it to like a premium gacha and then contest progress rewards, meaning like milestones. So every player can get some of these shards, but they just have to reach a certain point. And then you can move it to regular gacha. And if you continue this chain out, you can even move it to login rewards or whatever you want, give it away free at some point. And basically, it's about maximizing the price, or like the value of the item versus the quantity you're giving out. So this is just another way of looking at it. So on the one hand, we give away very few at a high price in contest rank rewards, and then over time the value diminishes. So price goes down, quantity goes up, and we start giving away in regular gacha. This is a really important thing to consider for sharding if you do choose to use it in hybrid casual, because it just ensures that you are not undervaluing what you're giving away, and it gives every hero or every character, whatever mechanic you're using, it gives them their own lifetime, and it gives their own desirability and their own spotlight almost. So in games that have limited content, you really want to make the most of it. So as I mentioned, I worked on Angry Birds 2, and I will refer back to Angry Birds 2 quite a lot in this presentation because it's a good example of hybrid casual. But we basically took the same model of sharding and applied it to rather a limited pool of heroes. We didn't want to come out with 50 versions of the red bird. Rather, we chose to have one version, which you have a level, which is determined by the number of feathers. So feathers are your shard equivalent in this. And basically, it was just a really simple way that everyone felt like they were constantly leveling up their core team. And then, you know, we had hat systems and whatever on top of that. But it's a very light implementation of sharding if you have a smaller pool of heroes or characters. So what are the key questions to consider in sharding? Things like, how can I best help my players to understand sharding within my game? How can I ensure that my game economy is deep enough to allow for it? Because again, if you have very little in your economy just boosters, for example, then that's not going to be very interesting for sharding. How much do I want to limit the availability of shards at different stages of the game? So this is about your product lifecycle management strategy, understanding how the player interacts with the different shards at different points. Here I'd also like to add a brief note on gacha, which is obviously very important these days in gaming. And it typically requires like a deep economy as well. So if players receive the same items from chests, they tend to stop buying chests, is my experience from working in live ops for many years. Light implementations for smaller economies is possible though. So Hungry Dragon is a reasonable example of this, where you can buy, eggs to get pets, and they have a decent pool of pets, and it's by no means essential, but it's a nice way of getting players to spend a bit and at the same time not needing crazy economy depth. In Angry Birds 2, there is gacha. I would say it's decent, again, because we have the shards, so you can constantly earn the feathers, and there are also a few different currencies for the hat shop, for continuing with extra birds at the end of a level, etc. But actually, the strongest tool for Angry Birds 2 is the Tower of Fortune, which is a more significant gacha system. It is a bit more gambling, but basically, if you haven't seen it, you have a choice. The image on the right-hand side, you have a choice of 4 cards. Behind one of the cards is a pig, and if you hit the pig, then you lose all of the rewards that you've gained on the left-hand side, and rewards increase with each floor of the tower that you go up. So what it does is it really creates the feeling of loss aversion. So you have all of your rewards displayed to you, and you're thinking, yeah, well, I've come this far, maybe just one more level, I'll get something cool. And then if you get a pig, then you definitely don't want to lose all the rewards that you have. It also gives the player a feeling of control, and like it's actually their fault that they chose the wrong card. So as I said, it's a little bit more gambling focused, but it's also quite a good mechanic if you would like to consider it. So another key part of this, as we've already touched on, is multiple progression drivers. Like this is really where I think RPG mechanics influence hybrid casual. So if we look at kind of traditional casual games around the year kind of 2012, we have like Angry Birds with the original, with its just kind of layout of levels. Then Candy Crush Saga brought in the kind of linear saga style map of trying to work your way through a world. And gradually things got more sophisticated. Now, if we look at 2020, we're looking at Archero, where instead of just having a saga progression, you have progression in talents, you have progression in equipment, and you have progression in actually character levels up as well. So it's very much taken from Marvel Strike Force or other similar games, as you can see, where they're really just trying to make sure that you have multiple progression drivers. So if you are hesitating about whether, like, do I continue playing this game or not? I'm so far away from leveling up my hero. Well, that's fine, but I can level up my cape right now, or I can spend on a new talent instead. And that just gives me the extra push to go, oh, well, maybe I'll stick with it a bit longer. I've still got stuff that I'm working on. And just as a point of interest, a comparison between Angry Birds 1 and Angry Birds 2 and how Angry Birds 2 became more of a hybrid casual game. As I said, on the left, we have very basic kind of level layout. On the right, we have your flock of birds with all their feather levels. We have hat shops, which determine different scores. You have a saga-style map in the similar style as Candy Crush, with rewards built into the map, things like chests and bosses. You have PvP leagues, you have clan leagues, and also a lot of these different mechanisms, they have sub-progressions within them. So you have like a streak reward for doing the daily challenge. So if you do it every day for a week, then you get an extra cool reward. You have streak rewards in the PvP league as well, where if you lose a match, then you need to try and you need to basically spend to preserve your streak and keep getting the better rewards. So there are a lot of progression kind of focus areas going on in Angry Birds 2. So some more key questions to consider on progression. How can I help my audience to understand all of these systems? Because understanding everything is really key, particularly if you're moving a more casual audience to something that's a little bit more deep, a little bit more mid-core. How much is too much? At what point should I stop adding progression systems? Because there is such a thing as too much. How do I prioritize which progression to develop first? Like, you know, what's going to make the biggest impact, but also what's going to be the most logical. And then the last part of this, I just want to talk briefly about social systems. So social systems are really great at prolonging the player lifetime. On the left image is a game called Knights and Dragons, which I worked on, which was really good at promoting guild wars. So guild wars were basically the metagame, in fact. It was such a big part of the game that people just came back to play Guild War and pretty much nothing else. Cooperation as well is like a really strong motivator, and I'm sure Joachim will recognize the image on the right, which is from The Walking Dead, Our World from Next Games. And basically, they have a brilliant system for creating the sense of responsibility. So you have a weekly challenge, and everybody contributes to the different tasks within that. So that's, you know, kill 1,000 zombies. The person who kills the most zombies out of your clan, they get their name kind of on that task and their image. So it's a very good way of showing, okay, who's not pulling their weight. And it creates this sense of social responsibility and forces you to go, okay, I need to be on top of this, because otherwise my guild are going to feel like I'm letting them down. There is also a sense of reciprocation in some games I've seen leveraged really well. In Knights and Dragons, we had a guild gifting system where basically if you were to buy a specific item, it would also gift a bunch of items to your guild, which as a guild member, if you receive items from someone else purchasing, you instantly go, oh, I should probably buy something as well. You know, I want to make sure I'm there, I'm pulling my weight, I'm a big part of this guild. This is actually, I think, my main complaint with Angry Birds 2, and where I think that there's still work that could be done, which is that the social systems in Angry Birds 2, I don't think feel essential. They are an addition to the gameplay, but they don't feel like they are a kind of heavy influencer on me staying or going. So I really think that if they were to push more on this, have a kind of a clearer UI direction, UX direction on what the top clans actually achieve, what kind of prestige they get, what kind of rewards they get, and just focus more on this side of things, I reckon they could really boost it further. So some key questions to consider in regards to social. How can I help my audience to understand all these systems? Again, is really important, transitioning from casual to hybrid casual, as we're calling it. How much is too much? Because again, I feel like Angry Birds would benefit, for example, by actually slowing down and maybe redesigning a system or two rather than adding more. How do I prioritize which progression to develop first? Because you have to consider things like, when is the player going to be arriving in game? At what point do I want this to unlock? Like, at what point do I want guilds to unlock? At what point should PvP unlock, etc.? And then just a few final thoughts. Kind of questions for the Q&A that I took it upon to answer myself. Like, is there such a thing as taking too much from mid-core games? Definitely. So there are 3 key checks that I would encourage when you're considering taking mechanics across. One is it understandable? This is the most important thing, because there are some very poor implementations out there of people who had brilliant ideas to transfer a system from mid-core RPG to casual, but because of the way it's been explained, or rather not explained, it leaves the players with a lot of confusion, and therefore the system doesn't really work. is it economically coherent? Like, can your economy actually take the system that you're proposing? Like, you need to make sure that there's enough depth, and you need to make sure that there's enough variety as well. And then, is it thematic or like core game coherent? This is more of a kind of artistic point, but the fact is that if you have something that feels very kind of artsy and indie with, you know, maybe some mid-core mechanics in the meta progression, like shoving a gacha system in might feel a bit at odds with how the rest of the game feels. So worth considering. I mean, to give you an example of that, actually, there is a solitaire game, which I mentioned on the right, which I'm really impressed with how much they've tried to stuff in there, because they've got a battle pass, a VIP scheme, a piggy bank, monetized minigames, limited quests. Like, they have so much stuff, but it doesn't feel necessarily relevant for a solitaire game.
Nick, well, I want to add one thing about Walking Dead, actually, which we were contemplating when we were adding some additions to the character collector, and concerns about like how many characters does the IP actually have. Like, you know, it's a TV show. It doesn't have like the Marvel universe.
Sure.
So the contemplation there was that people will just want to collect because of the visuals. You know, they love the star or the actor. And how much does that matter over utility inside the game? You know, differentiation from character A to character B, if they're too different. So that was a thing that we did notice, that when you're just adding new skins to something that is very similar, that it doesn't really pay off. People start saying that, okay, this is enough. Like, so it really matters that you have a flexible meta game where you can add this kind of like, you know, opposition to something else that you haven't catered for, versus like just doing a carbon copy with the different graphic assets on top.
Exactly. So you introduce a new hero, or even the same hero with a different outfit, but a new kind of buff. And then you need a counter for that buff from a different hero version. Yeah, as you say, everything needs to feel relevant and not just like you are trying to, I think the expression is nickel and dime your audience. You're not just trying to say, okay, look, here we've created a ton more content by changing all of the skins to slightly blue. You know, it needs to feel gameplay relevant.
Yeah.
And then just lastly, where do I feel there are still greater opportunities in hybrid casual? I'd say meaningful economy depth. I think that there are some games that I say do this quite well, but I feel like there are a lot where if you can really build a meaningful meta game that has a proper economy within it, then I think there's a lot of opportunity there. Further diversification in PvE and PvP path progression. So the example below are a couple of screens from Marvel Strike Force. At any one time, you have like pretty much 5 things going on. So these are 5 different paths, all of which are open. You have the Nexus, which is like more kind of hardcore. Then you have Villains United for your villains. You have Heroes Assemble for your heroes. And then on the right, you have like live ops events, which obviously change and cycle on a regular basis. But there always feels like there is some progress in a meaningful way to be made. It can feel a bit overwhelming, which is why obviously like making sure it's understandable and well introduced to your players is important. And then lastly, like I mentioned, the implementation of committed social mechanics. So there aren't that many games who have made it to hybrid casual that I think have brilliant social mechanics. I think Toon Blast is a good example of one that does, in terms of how it kind of drives like team-focused competitions and regular team play. But apart from that, it's actually quite difficult to come up with examples. Yeah, I overran a bit. I apologize for that, but thank you.
Oh, that was great. Thanks, Nick. Really good. Yeah. Let's go into questions. I have a lot of questions for you. So, but let's look at what the audience wants to hear first.
All right.
Big question here. I'll ask that as the last question. Do you feel that Archero lost its path? What do you think, man?
I don't know. I mean, I think it lost momentum because I guess with every game, at some point it's gonna peak. It's gonna like come out. Everyone's gonna go, "Wow, this is amazing," and then it will get cloned 20 times. Its mechanics will be seen in other games,
Mm,
and then it will still be there and it'll still be doing well, but you won't hear about it as much.
mm,
Um, I think that the things that they're adding make sense. Um, like in terms of like pushing more on the rarity levels, pushing on, for example, doing like hard mode versions of the same dungeons. Um, they're all very logical steps, but I feel like maybe some of them are just a little too late. As in, they had this early buzz, and particularly within the industry, I know a lot of people were very excited about it. But if they had been able to push this stuff a bit earlier, I think it probably would have made a much better impact.
mm. Yeah, for me, it feels like the controls are actually a limitation, like what you can actually do with your character. You can move up and down, stop, move again. So it's good like for onboarding, but like let's say day 30, it starts to feel like the depth is really like that there's no depth there. So that's sort of like a shame for me.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like you could start adding kind of other contextual events or player skills almost in the same way as like a non-stop night kind of game. But at the same time, I think there is definitely still an audience which is very much unfamiliar with more arcade titles. So I think the people who play Archero on a regular basis are ones who come back to it and actually enjoy those controls and enjoy the simplicity of it. Obviously, whenever you start adding more and more stuff and more events or more actions that you can take, there is always a risk. Um, and maybe I don't know. Maybe you're just not the kind of gamer that is expected to stay around beyond day 30. I don't
True,
know.
true. Yeah, that's also, I was just talking about this kind of like kicking the retention can down the road is never a good idea. I think it's
Yeah.
the earlier you can like point out that this game definitely won't last for, day 360, nobody's going to be here, versus like then, somebody else was thinking, of course it needs to last until like 360, and then there's a conflict because that wasn't decided early on. So
Yeah, I
it's
mean, it's very easy to get into the cycle of, okay, the game is doing well, but we only retain players for 30 days, so we need to market it constantly. And the graph that you showed earlier, where you are kind of getting, percentages left over from previous cohorts,
yeah.
fortunately becomes increasingly diminished.
Mm.
And it's a real shame because I think when you have a game and you obviously want to see it grow, there is little that is more satisfying than seeing like players from January 2018 still there in January 2020. It makes you actually feel like, okay, we are definitely on the right track. We have something.
Yeah, it's so much more than just a small game then.
Yeah.
uh, Question here, moving from casual core game uh, to something more deep and more complex, which might churn some people. Like I think it's question about the complexity here.
Yeah. I
Is that
mean,
a churn reason?
absolutely. I mean, for example, so I class myself as quite an active player of games, particularly in my job. I logged on to Apex the other night, and suddenly there is like a new currency, or they're talking about like CP, which I had to actually look around in the game and I was very confused at first as to what this actually meant. And they were saying like, oh yeah, you gain CP and you gain XP, and it's like, okay, tell me what CP is. Like some kind of tutorialization, some kind of thing saying, click on CP. This is what this means.
Yeah.
Um, I did eventually find it. It stood for challenge points, but this kind of this kind of thing makes players feel like they have lost control of their experience.
Hmm.
Um, so if I'm familiar with a game and I've been playing for hundreds of hours, and then I log in and suddenly something has changed and I just don't understand it, it makes me question, okay, like or it doesn't necessarily make me question. It just makes me feel like suddenly I'm having a negative experience. Like suddenly
Yeah.
I'm out of my depth in a game that I've been playing for over 100 hours. That seems crazy. I should
Mm.
understand everything.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think definitely like if you introduce new mechanics, it needs to be well integrated and well explained, because if it isn't, then you risk churning players, yeah, like all the time.
Yeah, I think like each time the player leaves, there's a judgment moment. Like, will they ever come back each
Yeah,
time? And like based on what kind of experience they had, if they had this kind of confusion moment, it's really bad. It's a red flag.
exactly. And it's you often only get one chance at this, as in if a player logs in, is confused by something, doesn't understand, and feels out of their depth, and then they leave, most often they won't come back.
No.
So, like, better to take more time over implementing new mechanics if you can feel, or if you feel like you can improve the explanation of them,
Mm.
than rushing out a new system, which 50% of your player base might understand, but the other 50 don't get at all and then leave.
Yeah, that's true. What advice would you give to Archo developers on utilizing and improving their battle pass monetization mechanic to boost retention and engagement? It seems like this is seriously lacking from their battle pass.
Yeah, so I mean, I think battle passes are inherently a kind of a cool way of doing things. I think I really like the model as a replacement to gacha because it encourages gameplay, it encourages long-term investment in a product.
Mm.
What I would say is like every battle pass needs to feel like there are rewards that are exclusive and that I'm going to feel like really special unlocking. And I mean, sometimes new skins, sometimes new weapons, whatever else, like that stuff feels really good. Um, but ultimately, like I want to feel like having invested usually a decent amount of money in a battle pass, that I am getting regular value paid out and then just periodic, like very special rewards that actually make me change the way that I play the game. I think is great. So the example that I gave earlier about the solitaire game, that's actually, they have a battle pass and they just give out a ton of boosters and soft currency.
Mm.
That changes nothing for me. Like I haven't played the game for that long, but I have enough boosters and I have enough soft currency. There is zero reason for me to invest. Give me
Mm.
something that is going to actually change the gameplay. Give me something that makes me feel like, okay, I'm happy I invested in this because now I feel overpowered for a few levels, or just this feeling of I was right to do so.
Yeah, yeah, makes sense.
But what do you think?
Well, I was thinking about the battle pass. It's like Clash Royale. I think there's starting to be this kind of like moment there for me, at least with a battle pass, that I don't really care anymore. Like I wouldn't buy it anymore. I don't need what they're giving me. So that's always like, is it really like, can you justify that you can at least see 12 months or 24 months ahead, that you can provide value with people like subscribing for the battle pass, meaning that they're going to be purchasing it each month? And like now I saw Brawl Stars actually, their battle pass is like over $10 versus most of the games are doing it for 5. So I think there's a lot of inflation happening for that mechanic as well when you're introducing it, in a sense like that, that it's not gonna, maybe Supercell went through that discussion already and decided that it's anyways going to be such a small cohort who's going to be converting, so let's just up the price tag here to make it actually worth the investment. It could be, I don't know.
Yeah, it could well be.
Mm.
But as you say, like particularly if you come into game and you are an active player and a committed player already, and then you see a battle pass which doesn't really offer you anything new,
Yeah.
then like it almost feels like, much in the same way that a lot of games use increased targeting for different promotions and events, like you almost need targeting for a battle pass as well. So you have 10 different SKUs of a battle pass,
Yeah.
and then you need to deliver them to different people based on their behaviors and their time in game.
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
it's not the most practical, but it's probably only a matter of time.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not. Yeah, there's so many other things that people should take a look at. Like, what would like I wanted to ask you a question about Angry Birds 2 because the game was sort of first out for a while and it wasn't really doing well, and then it suddenly jumped up in the top grossing charts. What was was there a single addition to the game? Was it the shards? What really mattered there?
It was a combination of things. So the shards were actually in there from the beginning,
Yeah.
but basically, so just to clarify this, I was in the design team and working on, like, I designed the monetization for it pre-launch, and then it got to launch and I had already left by that point. But basically, we were trying to make sure that we weren't upsetting a core player base from other Angry Birds games by being too IAP heavy.
Yeah.
So the first impression of the game had to be, okay, players are going to come in and they're not going to be bombarded with IAPs. They're going to actually, feel like they're constantly making progress at zero cost to themselves. There's going to be some good ad integration to make sure that, for younger players, they feel comfortable, etc.
Yeah.
Um, so that was really the focus. And then I think, that worked okay initially, obviously. But then the big change, I think, largely came from a couple of things. One was introducing these kind of multiple progression drivers. So we had already PvP in there, but they introduced PvP streaks and daily challenges, which then obviously was, like, I think, really good for just enforcing retention.
Mm.
And then things like the Tower of Loot, or the Tower of Fortune rather, on top of that. And the Tower of Fortune, I believe, makes over 30% of the revenue, I think I read somewhere.
Wow.
So it's like, that was really a big deal for them. And they've since used it also in things like Angry Birds Evolution. Um, I haven't seen it in any of their other titles so far, but yeah.
Wow. That's good. Uh, Another question here. Following the example of the overloaded solitaire game with too much mid-core elements, do you think that these type of mechanics have no place in classical puzzle games like Jigsaw, word puzzles, Mojang, those kind of things?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, from a personal standpoint, I think, like, I would always be reluctant to play a game that actually had too many of these kind of mechanics, or at least that's what I thought. But then actually, the solitaire game I mentioned, I'm still playing it. Like, it's not making my experience worse particularly. The occasional pop-ups are getting in the way of it, but it's not that bad.
Yeah.
And I think mostly it depends on the core game mechanics. People will tolerate a lot if the core game is really solid, which it is in this game. So, like, yes, it is overloaded and I feel like it's too much, but I'm still playing it because the core game is still fun. And I have to say, I kind of admire them on just a professional level for how much stuff they're trying out in a genre that doesn't really suit it.
That's interesting. Yeah. Uh, what do you think about retention plus IAP mechanics in casual games? Do you like you purchase something which gives rewards every day, aiming at increasing the engagement of PU? Um,
So, firstly, hi, Georgi. And yeah, basically, I think that, like, I mean, this is referring to more like a kind of subscription style model, right? Like,
yeah, I guess it's
rewards
like the
every day.
battle pass in a sense, but
Yeah, so I mean, well, Battle Pass is obviously, like, related to player engagement within the game.
mm,
Um, like, kind of regardless of what day it is, I can play intensively for a day and then leave it for a week, and I might be at the same stage as someone who's played for every day for a week.
yeah,
Whereas, like, something a bit more subscription based, like, in Dragon Soul we had it actually where you could buy like a month of gems, and every day you would receive a certain amount of gems. Um, I think those systems work really well for, let's say, for lower revenue per paying user games.
Mm.
Um, if you have a deep economy with the potential for much higher revenue per paying user, then I would typically avoid more subscription-based models, because though they are good for engagement for certain cohorts, they are also problematic in that you have to give usually quite high value for them to make sense for people.
Yeah.
So you can't just give someone 10 gems a day for logging in. You need to make sure it's a decent amount and balanced within your economy.
Mm.
But often I feel like subscription base is slightly overbalanced because you want that player to continue returning every day.
Mm.
So they typically are a bit more generous.
Yeah, makes sense. A question here, which it's a bit different kind of question. So, what content would you suggest is needed before launching a market test for a casual game like Archero?
Um,
I have my answer, but I'll let you go first.
well, I mean, honestly, I think you're better placed to answer this than I am in terms of starting a company and launching games more often. But I would say that like basically you can start doing market testing as soon as you have like a really solid core gameplay. I think that's the most important thing.
Mm.
Beyond that, I think the systems that you should look to add would obviously be based around kind of retaining for, let's say, the short to mid-term. So I was talking to some developers about this recently, actually. They were talking about going soft launch with the game and then adding, lots of kind of end game content. And I said to them, okay, but how long is your existing content going to take? Oh, yeah, that's going to be lasting for months. Like, well, then don't bother adding more end game content right now. That doesn't make sense. Focus
Yeah.
on like optimizing the front end of your game. Make sure the first time user experience is great. Make sure that the core gameplay is as crisp as you want it to be. And basically, yeah, I think as soon as you have those things in place, and ideally, I would say maybe 1 to 2 weeks worth of content,
Mm.
you can already start like market testing.
Mm.
But what do you think?
Yeah, I was just about to say core gameplay as well is good enough. I think like outside of the test, you need to already realize that the gameplay that you're gunning for, what kind of meta game can it actually facilitate? Like, I think it's really interesting because if you don't really have a combat-based game, it's always a bit like a different limitation on what you're doing. So Angry Birds, I would say, is a combat game still because you have to, use the controls in very specific ways to beat challenging moments. But like is like Perfect Cream. Do you know this hyper casual game from Legendary, which is
I
basically,
don't, I'm afraid.
yeah, it's like, you're in a bakery and there's like a conveyor belt that's taking cakes in front of you
Yeah,
and you need to squeeze the cream at the right point. It
yeah,
like you could have a brainstorming on like what kind of like deep mid-core meta game you could put on top of that. It might be interesting and play around with it. But I think these kind of questions you can already answer without a test internally, like with the group of people you're making the game with friends, and evaluating, and then going out when you sort of know that, hey, this is gonna, we don't need to test that right now, but here's the things we want to test first.
yeah.
uh, Another question here, what are the early metrics a developer should be looking for validating a hybrid casual game? This is going to be the last question, but I think we can continue this on LinkedIn when I post the recording on the website. So, but yeah, what are the early metrics? What do you think?
So I would say, I mean, the most important metrics you're going to be looking at are like obviously like D1, D3, I'd say D7 retention should be your kind of your highest retention one. You don't need to look at D30 when validating. That is part of a gameplay loop that can come later. Um, you should ideally be looking at then more like session specific metrics. So let's say median or even modal, like session time per user, as well as number of sessions per day. And yeah, I mean, I think those would be the most important, because you're more focused on engagement, and validating like the engagement basically means that you are also just seeing how well your core loop is functioning. If your core loop is functioning well, you can add monetization to that. You can add, all the late game meta stuff you want to, but without the core loop, then nothing else will work. So I'd say that's definitely like the most important stuff to focus on.
Totally agree. Hey, thanks, Nick. This was really fun.
Yeah, likewise. I'm happy.
Yeah, I'm gonna share the recording later, hopefully this evening, and I'll let everybody know about this. So, but yeah, stay safe, people. Don't go too close to each other.
Yeah, good call.
Bye
See you,
bye.
everyone. Bye.